My name is Jill Beckett. I'm on the committee of the Quaker Socialist Society. Just a technical detail to begin with. For people who want the captions, the link to the captions is in the chat, and Julie is the captioner. So, the Quaker Socialist Society, what are we? Who are we? We aim to be a Quaker presence in the socialist movement and make the insights of socialism available for Quakers. We stand for ethical socialism, social justice, and a fair, safe, and peaceful world. We hope that you may want to join us. You don't need to be either a Quaker or a member of any political party, just to be in broad sympathy with our aims. Our roots are as old as the Quaker movement itself. There are connections between Quakers and the 17th century levellers and the diggers, both of those movements thought of as early socialists before the word was coined. In the 1690s, the Quaker John Bellers, seeing the necessity for reform of society, devised practical measures for educating the poor and ending unemployment. Later socialists, such as Robert Owen and Karl Marx, praised Bellers as a pioneer of socialism. By the 1890s, when Christian socialism was establishing itself as a political force, a socialist Quaker society was formed, not altogether welcomed by all Quakers, but intended as a bottom-up movement of cooperatives based on Quaker testimonies. The society produced a magazine, The Ploughshare. Contributors included Bertrand Russell, Fenner Brockway, and Alfred Salter. The society dwindled as its leading lights moved into public life, becoming elected as MPs or councillors. But in the 1970s, the society regrouped to become the Quaker Socialist Society, issuing a regular newsletter and, its best known achievement, putting on an annual lecture named after two Quaker and socialist pioneers, Ada and Alfred Salter, who worked in Bermondsey, one of the poorest parts of London, a century ago. Alfred, a doctor, set up free clinics for the poor, while Ada devoted her life to clearance of the appalling local slums, setting up a model housing estate. She was also a pioneer in campaigning against air pollution, creating parks, children's playgrounds, tree-lined streets. In 1922, Alfred was elected as MP for Bermondsey, and Ada became the first woman mayor in London and the first Labour woman mayor in Britain. A truly pioneering couple, worthy of memorial in giving their name to our annual lecture. And those giving those lectures follow in their footsteps of being grounded in both Quaker and socialist values, and active in promoting them. And so I hand you over to Sheila to introduce our inspiring Salter lecturer for 2021.
2 years ago, when we began considering who might give the next Salter lecture, we were very conscious of the fact that we had still never had a black lecturer. And then we discovered Nozizwe Madlala-Routledge, a woman who had been born under the apartheid regime, joined the illegal struggle to oppose it, and been imprisoned 3 times, including a year in solitary confinement, who had been in the team that negotiated South Africa's transition to democracy and drafted its constitution, who had been elected to their new parliament in 1994 as one of its first black MPs, and served 5 years as Deputy Minister of Defence, 3 years as Deputy Minister of Health, and a year as their Deputy Speaker. Why had we never heard of her before, we wondered? A woman whose life raised so many questions for us. How could she have been an illegal freedom fighter and also a Quaker? How did she take those decisions that endangered her life? What was it like to govern her country alongside people who had been her bitter enemies? That summer, we met Nozizwe when she was in London visiting her son. We invited her to see the Salter statues in Bermondsey and gave her a copy of Ada Salter's biography, hoping to make her feel part of our history. for we saw a parallel between these two Quaker socialist women. Despite being born in different centuries and on different continents, both of them had devoted their lives to improving the world for the good of all. One had transformed her local community, the other had transformed her country. There were so many questions we might have asked Nozizwe, but how could we possibly know what was most significant for her personally or for her country? So we agreed a title that left it as open as possible: Quaker Values in the South African Struggle. At that time, we knew of no actual connection between South Africa's struggle and the Salters. However, we recently learned that in 1914, when the leading African intellectual, Sol Plaatje, came to England seeking support for the liberation struggle, Ada and Alfred Salter were amongst his audience. After Plaatje spoke at a meeting in Bermondsey, Alfred sent him a cheque for £25, probably the largest single donation Plaatje ever received, with a message asking him to accept the gift from his wife and himself, quote, as an expression of our love and goodwill towards the people of your race, who have so often been wronged by the people of my race. What a joy it is to be able to welcome Nozizwe by echoing the words of Alfred Salter himself. Wouldn't he and Ada have loved it? We are delighted and honoured to have her speak to us today. As usual with these events, we will begin with a short Quaker silence, and Nozizwe will start speaking when she is ready.
Thank you, Sheila, for that introduction. Thank you, friends, for coming. It is a great honor for me to give the 2021 Salter Lecture on Quaker Values in South Africa's Struggle at the Britain Yearly Meeting. I thank the Quaker Socialist Society for celebrating the amazing lives of Ada and Alfred Salter. I'd been looking forward to joining you in person last year, but a year later, here we are, meeting online due to COVID-19. I bring you greetings from the Quaker community of Southern Africa Yearly Meeting, which is meeting at this time, virtually like you. Ada Salter's life of activism and political engagement fascinates me, as it speaks of a deep commitment to transformative public service. Born a Methodist and of liberal background, she embraced radical and pacifist views in her youth. She not only opposed wars, she also campaigned for women's suffrage, social justice, and workers' rights. I was fascinated that the Salters succeeded in bringing politics and health together in the service of all. When thinking about this talk, I went back and forth in time, looking at my own role as a social activist in the national liberation movement to end apartheid, and in my role as a politician in a free South Africa. Even though I was not born a Quaker, the Quaker testimonies to peace alongside justice, equality, simplicity, integrity, community, and stewardship of the earth have had a tremendous influence in the decisions I took. Quakers believe in living life in the spirit of love and truth and peace, reaching for the best in oneself and answering that of God in everyone. Quaker testimonies or spiritual insights unite us worldwide and are expressions of the commitment to put those beliefs into practice. The peace testimony has evolved over 350 years in response to a changing world. Quakers have been faithful throughout in maintaining a corporate witness against all war and violence. However, in our personal lives, we have continually to wrestle with the difficulty of finding ways to reconcile our faith with practical ways of living it out in the world. It is not surprising, therefore, that we have not always all reached the same conclusions when dealing with the daunting complexities and moral dilemmas of society and its government. I was raised on the African values of Ubuntu. A person is a person through others. In Guns and Gandhi in Africa by Bill Sutherland and Matt Mayer, Archbishop Desmond Tutu writes in the foreword about Ubuntu as the essence of what it means to be human, as a source for compassion, and the idea that, I quote, "My humanity is bound up in yours, for we can only be truly human together," unquote. This is the fundamental principle of nonviolent struggle. The value of Ubuntu aligns with the Quaker value of seeing that of God in the other. When Africans were converted to Christianity, some of these values were lost, together with a whole lot of other precious attributes that defined what it means to be an African. Despite this, great African leaders like Tanzania's Julius Nyerere developed education for their newly independent countries based on philosophy as represented by ujamaa, a Swahili word for familyhood. Education in this context is designed to make all citizens of Africa self-reliant. Self-reliance is portrayed in economics, politics, and social cultures. A self-reliant person does not exploit other people, and at the same time, they are not exploitable. Ujamaa is about African socialism, a belief in sharing economic resources in a traditional African way, as distinct from classical socialism. The Black Consciousness Movement slogan, "People shall share," was an attempt to entrench and promote African socialism, while also addressing internalized racism and restoring a positive image of what it means to be Black. I was introduced to Black consciousness as a student when I attended a youth camp organized by Steve Biko and others at the Mahatma Gandhi settlement in Phoenix, just outside Durban. They had chosen one of Gandhi's ashrams for raising the awareness of young people like me about the importance of social awareness and nonviolence. Gandhi developed the philosophy of satyagraha, which influenced the national liberation struggle in South Africa, India, and beyond. During the camp, we visited the local village to conduct a community survey and learn about people's living conditions and basic needs. These Black consciousness ideas of self-reliance are built into the Gandhian philosophy of satyagraha, or soul force. The thread which ties spiritual and social liberation together as inseparable forces is tightly and colorfully woven through Ubuntu and Ujamaa, from Black consciousness to satyagraha, from letting one's life speak to the work of Ada Salter, to my childhood, to our virtual togetherness here today. Growing up as a child in an African village, I was taught to greet everyone, including strangers. In isiZulu, when two people meet, they stop and say, "Sanibona," meaning, We see you, often followed by Ninjani, how are you? Greetings are in plural to indicate we are not meeting as individuals, but as representatives of our families and our communities. My family greets your family. My community greets your community. I saw a reawakening of this tradition in Philadelphia during the COVID-19 lockdown, when strangers started to greet one another. Previously, I'd seen people walking past, wearing headphones, and not bothering to greet. A senior citizen in the community where I grew up often reminds me, with a broad smile, of how much she appreciated the gesture when I used to take her tea when she was tilling her fields in the village. I'm sure this would have been on instruction from my grandmother, and we probably got paid back in kindness and madumbis, or yams. And as the cry that Black Lives Matter went up around the United States and the world, considering the murder of George Floyd, the echoes brought me back to Sanibona. We can be certain that our lives matter when we are able to truly see one another. Raised as a Christian, I realized I made my grandmother uncomfortable when I asked why she had abandoned African spiritual beliefs. I now know that she too was struggling with these questions, even though she was grateful for the education she had received from the missionaries. In my adulthood, I'm grateful to my grandmother, my mother, my teachers, the women in the Natal Organization of Women, and fellow activists in the struggle for freedom, who taught me resilience and the values of Ubuntu, were human because of others. When I was in solitary confinement, I often had vivid dreams of my grandmother, who had died a few months before. I believe her spirit was present in my mind at that difficult time. I drew immense strength from the power of struggle songs. Often sung in rallies and protest marches, they had the power to instill amazing courage and fearlessness. Even though I was alone, I felt a sense of being connected to my comrades through singing struggle songs. I was attracted to Quakers through my interaction with a small Quaker community in Durban in the early 80s. In 1983, I had been part of establishing the Natal Organization of Women, which joined the United Democratic Front, the UDF. The UDF was formed as a broad coalition of civic organizations established in August 1983 to oppose the whites-only referendum for a new constitution that created a tricameral parliament for whites, Indians, and Coloureds, while excluding the Black African majority. Now worked closely with the youth and were concerned that the youth was getting militarized in their responses to state violence. Our own strategy was to organize marches, peaceful protests, and night vigils. During one of our night vigils, we invited Richard Steele, a Quaker and conscientious objector, to address our night vigil as part of promoting nonviolent forms of resistance. When he had been called up on 4 July 1979 to serve in the whites-only South African Defence Force, Steele had written a letter explaining that he would be unable to report for duty due to him being a pacifist. When he was called again the following year, he refused to serve and was sentenced to 18 months imprisonment. While in prison, he began to question his long-term congregation, the Baptists. He read about Mahatma Gandhi and came to respect his teachings. After his release, Steele traveled the world, learning and seeking a more integrated spirituality. On his return, he served as a caretaker of the Gandhi Center in Durban and became a Quaker. He, his wife, Anita Krombeck, Jeremy Routledge, and others were active in the End Conscription campaign and the Conscientious Objector Support Group. Jeremy was also an active member of the National Education Union of South Africa, NUSA, a non-racial teachers union. He, Richard, Anita, and other young whites had joined the struggle to end apartheid, mobilizing against militarism and in solidarity with the oppressed Black majority. As Quakers, they actively participated in campaigns in support of detainees and exposing and opposing state-sponsored Black-on-Black violence. Jeremy was also active in the detainees support group. Jeremy and I found love across the color line following our detention without trial. Jeremy was detained for a month during the national state of emergency in 1986. I was detained for just under a year in 1987 under the Internal Security Act, which gave the apartheid state powers to detain activists indefinitely without trial. We were married in January 1989 in a blended African traditional Christian and Quaker ceremony, attended by friends, relatives, comrades, and the local community. The wedding took place in the rural village where I was born, and the African traditional part of the ceremony included ilobolo, an exchange of gifts that united our two families and our peoples. To this day, Jeremy is loved and regarded as umkhwenyana or son-in-law by the whole village. Our children are their children. The backdrop to all of this was that the Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act, which prohibited marriage or sexual relationship between white people and people of other race groups, had been repealed, while the Group Areas Act was still in place, and were not allowed to live under one roof in a white designated area. Despite our different racial backgrounds, Jeremy and I found we had much in common. We both had a parent who was a teacher, and we both studied science, had grown up in rural KwaZulu-Natal, and we shared a concern to end racial injustice. We had become activists, mobilizing our communities and reaching across the artificial boundaries created by apartheid. Quakers believe we should let our work speak for us. These friends, who were mostly white, connected their spiritual lives with political action, their connection to humanity and the good in all people, and the God in all people, with their opposition to violence in the form of racist policy and militarized defense. They recognized that for them to be free, they needed to give up white privilege and join the struggle for a non-racial, democratic, and equal society. All these actions connected with the African values at the heart of my upbringing. The question of whether to support the ANC in the struggle to end apartheid caused intense debate among Quakers globally. Since the adoption of armed struggle in December 1961, the ANC's strategy had moved from a totally non-violent struggle to one that incorporated violence, particularly under pressure from its youth wing, of which Mandela was part. The 1960s marked an important watershed in South Africa's struggle against apartheid. The aftermath of the Sharpeville massacre in March 1960, in a firing by the police that lasted for approximately 2 minutes, leaving 69 unarmed protesters dead, and according to the official inquest, 180 people seriously wounded. This killing of unarmed peaceful protesters signaled the beginning of a far more brutal and intensive phase of state repression that would crush internal resistance in the space of a few years. South African Quakers had challenged the abuse of race and power. However, the question of support for the ANC caused debate among friends. I became aware of these debates during a Southern Africa yearly meeting I attended in 1988 in Botswana. A representative of the American Friends Service Committee challenged friends about their ambivalence, and this raised a heated debate in the meeting, whose main objection was that the ANC was associated with the South African Communist Party and it embraced armed struggle. Hendrik van der Merwe was a South African Quaker, academic and peacemaker who grew up in a conservative rural Calvinist Afrikaner community in the Western Cape. He was actively involved as a mediator in South Africa meeting with leaders from the ruling National Party and Homelands, the exiled, imprisoned leaders of the African National Congress, and the internal resistance led by the United Democratic Front. In aligning with the oppressed, Javier, as we called him, gained their trust while continuing to put pressure on the powerful. Javier explained that when forced to choose a side in a conflict, he would choose the side of the powerless or the oppressed. This explained to me that Quakers can be pragmatic yet principled when faced with complex decisions. I had not begun to challenge the ANC's adoption of armed struggle as one of the 4 pillars of the anti-apartheid struggle. I felt the ANC had made the decision as a last resort in response to a massive onslaught on an unarmed resistance, as illustrated by the Sharpeville massacre of 1960. A way to think about this is that, firstly, my support for Umkhonto weSizwe, the military wing of the ANC, was informed by a belief that the system of apartheid was cruel and unjust, and that we were fighting an illegitimate regime. I had not begun to question whether or not the means justify the end. Secondly, the armed struggle was only a tiny part of the pillars of the liberation struggle, and that the defeat of apartheid was due largely to the other pillars: underground organization, mass mobilization, and international solidarity. Archie Gumede, a stalwart of the liberation struggle and former chairperson of the UDF, stated that, and I quote, "The armed struggle did have some effect in showing that people could resist oppression. It boosted morale," unquote. My position began to shift after engaging with Quakers in my small meeting in Durban. However, violence had broken out in our townships, led by armed Zulu warriors, recruited by and aligned to Buthelezi Zinkatha Freedom Party. During one of the attacks, someone had fired a gun into the air, which caused the warriors to disperse. This caused debate among us about whether the use of violence to counter violence was ever justified. There was reason to think if the police were not protecting us, we would have to protect ourselves, especially following the advent of state-sponsored black-on-black violent attacks. I now fully embrace nonviolence as a method of struggle, as both the means and the end. Today, as a Quaker, I support the peace testimony in full as I look at the aftermath of apartheid and colonial violence in South Africa. The deep-seated culture of violence is proving difficult to uproot, confirming the adage that violence breeds violence, and that we should continue to oppose all wars and preparation for war. However, while always anti-military, our non-violence must be ever more militant, supporting revolutionary change in the face of oppression through mass unarmed civil resistance and non-military means. My appointment as Deputy Minister of Defense in 1999 came as a total surprise, and I wrestled with this issue, which questioned my pacifist beliefs and caused debate among Quakers and the media. The Christian Science Monitor commented that it was either a stroke of brilliance or a monumental gaffe. That is my appointment. When I got the call from the Secretary General of the ANC on behalf of President Beki, I told him he had called the wrong number. When he insisted he had the right number, I told him I would need time to think about it. He gave me half an hour. I was alone in the house, and the first thing I did was go on my knees to pray for guidance. People have asked me why I chose politics as a career. My answer is that I did not choose politics. Politics chose me. By that I mean it was impossible to ignore injustice around me and not be involved. My entry into politics was through the national liberation struggle. Growing up in rural apartheid South Africa, I did not even begin to dream of becoming a member of parliament. In any case, this was not even possible at the time. Blacks were not allowed to vote, let alone to be voted into positions of power. There were good reasons for feeling that it would be the right decision to make to become South Africa's first female pacifist Deputy Minister of Defense. I found support among Quakers who debated the issue at our yearly meeting in 2000. We adopted a statement on peace in Africa, an outcome and testimony to Quaker process of consensus building. South Africa and the world had witnessed a miracle, something I had never dreamed would happen in my lifetime. We had seen Mandela walking out of prison and start negotiations to end apartheid. South Africa had installed our first democratically elected, non-racial, non-sexist parliament with Mandela as our president. As a newly elected member of parliament myself, I had sat across from my former enemies in the parliamentary chamber and had witnessed a military fly past in the colors of our new flag, Salute Mandela, at the inauguration, where I had seen global leaders who came to witness this amazing change. Our country had been welcomed back into the global community as an important player in the effort to achieve global peace. This was a time of change and optimism, both locally and globally. Under the new constitution, the policy and defense posture began to undergo radical transformation from state security to an all-encompassing condition in which individual citizens live in freedom, peace, and safety, participate fully in the process of governance, enjoy the protection of fundamental rights, have access to resources and the necessities of life, and an environment in which is not detrimental to their health and well-being. I have a dog-eared signed copy of the Human Security Now report that our former Speaker of the National Assembly, Dr. Frini Chinwala, gave me. She was Democratic South Africa's first woman speaker and was one of a 12-person commission on human security that produced the UN report in 2003. The report describes the concept of human security as freedom from want and freedom from fear. This is the concept of security South Africa had embraced and which made it easy for me to relate to my role in the Ministry of Defense. We had argued that it was important to increase the participation of women in all peace and security structures and processes and at all levels of decision making. We stressed the importance of their presence in sufficient numbers to form a critical mass, at least a third, to make a difference. As MPs and as part of the women's movement, we had established strong connections with feminists outside of Parliament who helped shape national policy and legislation. I could therefore draw on a large pool of activists who were more than willing to help me develop programs aimed at transforming the role of the military in a democracy. I became aware of the work of Sidney Bailey at the United Nations when his widow sent me a copy of his book, Peace is a Process, published by the Quaker Home Service and Woodbrook College in 1993. This assured me of the important role Quakers can play in influencing high-level diplomacy. Bailey was a conscientious objector during World War II, spending several years in the Friends Ambulance Service. Through the opportunities afforded me in the new South Africa we had fought for, the core beliefs which always guided me, and my new experiences from leading fellow parliamentarians, UN experts, and Quaker-informed diplomacy, my work as a Deputy Minister of Defense while attending Quaker meeting opened a new world, not of conflict or contradiction, but of challenging questions about creative nation building. As Deputy Minister of Health during the HIV and AIDS crisis in South Africa, I drew strength from the call to speak truth to power. I was saddened to see people dying needlessly from AIDS when they were refused treatment in our public health facilities. I could not understand the refusal by my government to deny HIV-positive pregnant women access to nevirapine to prevent transmission of HIV from mother to child. When I heard about the babies dying at Frere Hospital in the Eastern Cape and went on an unannounced visit to investigate the cause, this had angered the Minister of Health at the time, who was promoting only the use of nutrition and traditional remedies instead of the scientific approach to the treatment of people with AIDS. I took the decision to speak publicly in support of science-based interventions, and this led to my dismissal by the president after several warnings for me to say only what the Minister of Health was saying. In speaking truth to power, my aim was not to embarrass the president, but to take a principled stand on the side of the powerless, the people who were dying needlessly because they were being denied life-prolonging medicines by their own government. Though I was famously fired from the position as Deputy Minister of Health in an act which still casts more criticism on the president, who fired me, than on my own forthright acts, my Quaker orientation helped me make it clear on what side of the principled, pragmatic pole I should fall. Friends have never been diffident about offering advice to rulers about how to achieve peace. I'm inspired by the Quaker mission to Tsar Nicholas in 1854 in the hope to avert the Crimean War. A panel from the Quaker tapestry by Mary Mason and family illustrates this Quaker effort to prevent war. The inscription on the tapestry says, I quote, "Almighty Prince, may the miseries and devastation of war be averted. Speak truth to power." Looking at the compromise in diplomatic work, Sidney Bailey answers the question of how we can distinguish between a concession of marginal importance, a sacrifice of vital national interest, and a violation of personal conscience. He says, and I quote, "Friends often ask for an enhancement of the moral element in international decision-making, and they are quite right to do so," unquote. At the same time, we should recognize that for the harassed foreign minister or ambassador, the distinction between the pragmatic and the ethical is often blurred. Our commitment to peace and justice should be infectious so that we can inspire others we share in the process. I was inspired by Audre Lorde, an American writer who dedicated her life and her work to confronting and addressing injustices of racism, sexism, classism, capitalism, heterosexism, and homophobia. And she served as an inspiration. She says, and I quote, "When I dare to be powerful, to use my strength in the service of my vision, then it becomes less and less important whether I'm afraid." I've learned that freedom is a constant struggle, and that every generation must play their part in defending the gains made by those before it. Recently, I was thinking about my role as an activist, and Psalms 121, which I'd learned to recite as a child, came to me. I thought of an activist as someone who stands up for others, who's willing to sacrifice his or her own freedom to help others gain theirs. I thought of Mandela, who said, "We are not free until all are free." So when I left formal politics in 2009, after serving for 15 years, I had not abandoned my role as an activist for change. I feel strongly that wide-ranging basic rights in the Constitution must be given expression in people's lives, which includes mobilizing them to become active citizens, participating in elections and in between elections through public participation. Jeremy and I established Embrace Dignity, a non-profit abolitionist feminist organization that seeks to challenge gender power inequalities that continue to oppress women, girls, and other marginalized people through the system of prostitution, sexual exploitation, sexual abuse, and patriarchy. We are campaigning for the abolitionist equality model pioneered in Sweden and adopted by a growing number of countries. Our aim is to restore the rights of women and girls to equality, life, dignity, human security, and psychosocial integrity, rights our Constitution has promised to all South Africans. What are the most pressing issues facing us and the world today, and how should we respond as Quakers? How do we ensure social, economic, and climate justice for all? How do we respond to the call for reparations for colonization, slavery, and apartheid? as well as the intergenerational trauma that these systems of oppression have caused. The Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust issued a statement on 15 April 2021, acknowledging, and I quote, that the roots of the trust's wealth stems from slavery, colonialism, and white supremacy. In the statement, the trust stated that the Rowntree Company purchased cocoa and other goods produced by enslaved people, while the company itself benefited from the system of colonial indenture. The statement says, Wilson Rowntree, the South African subsidiary of the Rowntree Company, was also responsible for highly oppressive and exploitative practices during the apartheid era. Additionally, how do we respond to the hashtag Black Lives Matter and the hashtag #MeToo campaigns? How do we ensure a just peace in Palestine, Ethiopia, and Myanmar, to name but a few places of violent conflict? As the saying goes, we do not inherit the earth from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children. How do we contribute to righting the wrongs of the past? The statement issued by the Joseph Rowntree opens an opportunity for British Quakers to partner with the Southern Africa Quaker community in our effort to end poverty through the work of our yearly meeting. Thank you, friends, for listening. I hope I've inspired you to continue the good work you are doing to make the world better than you found it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nozizwe. And we do have 15 minutes left. And I'm going to invite people to ask questions in the chat, and I'll read them out. And I'll prioritize questions that are linked to the title of the lecture. There has been one already, which is a question asking whether you could comment at all about what we're seeing on our television screens at the moment from South Africa.
Thank you, friends. We've all been saddened and shocked by the violent protests that broke out in our country recently, initially in response to the imprisonment of Jacob Zuma for defying an order of the highest court on our land. We saw looting of private property and burning. We now understand that these violent protests took advantage of a situation that we must address in our country, the situation of poverty and inequality. The instigators, of course, are still unknown to us. Some of them have been arrested, and we look to see them being held accountable for what has been characterized as an attempted insurrection in our country. But we are heartened by the response of the majority of South Africans who've stood up, some of them to protect their communities, and now in the last few days to clean up the mess that was left behind. We're encouraged by organizations like Gift of the Givers, ordinary South Africans who have donated food to help others in distress. The Quaker community of Southern Africa has put together a statement, and we will be issuing the statement on this. And as part of that statement, we will be calling on people to help one another, to recognize the harms of the protests that have happened, but more importantly, to support one another so that we can see the change that Mandela went to prison for in our country. The change has been too slow. I think this has been a wake-up call to our government that something needs to happen to change the lives of our people.
Thank you. And the chat is open for questions. They don't have to come quickly. Silence is fine too. And I'll choose one in a moment. Okay, there's a question. You mentioned the state-sponsored black-on-black violence towards the end of the apartheid era in particular. Do you think that comparable tactics are being used to divide people against one another, especially in progressive movements now?
Definitely. In the recent protests in South Africa, we were quite aware of urgent provocateurs who mobilized people on ethnic differences. We are aware that going back during the times of apartheid, Black people were set up against one another. And this was at a time when the world was looking at South Africa, and South Africa could no longer do what they'd done before, incarcerate people without trial. So developed what was called a total strategy against total onslaught, which included training counter people to go into these communities and cause confusion. We believe that with the protests that happened here in this country, the same tactics were being used. Tires were being driven around and given to people to burn their own, to burn the infrastructure, to burn the shops. It's a very similar tactic. We believe that this is happening in other countries as well. And as I look at Palestine and Israel, I am certain that it's the same modus operandi where such tactics are used to divide people.
There's a question along a similar theme, but also bringing in something you said from your lecture. Obviously, in the peace movement, there's a whole debate about whether the means justify the ends, but also whether the means influence the ends. And there's a question asking, is there a possibility, do you think there's any link between the armed struggle part of the anti-apartheid campaign and what's happening now, or do you think they're completely different?
I think it is connected. Some of the people that have been organized, that have been part of instigating violence, wore military fatigues. They identified themselves as veterans of Umkhonto Wesizwe, the military wing of the ANC. Of course, the ANC has now had to deal with that because this veteran, Umkhonto Wesizwe, the military wing itself was closed, was shut down. And yet these people are mobilizing around the militarism and using the legacy of Umkhonto Wesizwe. I mentioned in my lecture that we have deep-rooted violence in our country, which developed in response to state violence. And for South Africa to move forward, we need to address this very deep-seated culture. And in our statement, which we've put together in response to the violence, we are promoting Quaker values. We are saying alternatives to violence. The Alternatives to Violence project needs to be made widespread so that people are given alternative ways to express their frustration. We acknowledge that people are deeply frustrated. People are hungry. I mentioned the fact that there's grinding poverty, unemployment, but we are saying that there are non-violent means of achieving change, and this is what we are promoting.
Thank you. It's a question about Nelson Mandela. Would you be able to give us, there are people on this, in this conversation from all around the world, but the majority of us are based in Britain. Could you give us an insight on how Nelson Mandela is seen now, especially among younger people? Is he still seen as a symbol of forgiveness and hope and reconciliation, or is he seen as something else?
I would say we need another Nelson Mandela. I think Nelson Mandela remains a person who united us, a symbol of forgiveness and reconciliation. Of course, among younger people who do not see the change that their parents sacrificed for, they are beginning to question whether Mandela did not compromise too much, whether in the process, in the negotiated settlement of which I was part, we were vigilant enough to pick up all the issues. I think then we focused a lot on a political change. We did not focus on economic change, and that is beginning to bite. People are beginning to feel the inequality that's very visible in South Africa between rich and poor. So when they think about Mandela, I think they still honor him as our citizen who sacrificed for our freedom, but they are saying in order for Mandela's dream to become a reality, the present government has a responsibility to go back to the drawing board. They're even calling for an economic codesa where we can sit down and negotiate how change will happen in the economic structure of our country so that it benefits all. South Africa is a moderately rich country. We have enough resources in our country for everyone to be fed, for everyone to be clothed, but our system creates huge inequalities, and economic inequality has deepened, and we need to address this.
And on this theme, there's a lot of questions about what is happening to help increase economic equality in South Africa in particular. Also, how can friends in other countries support with that?
Just repeat the question.
I suppose, could you share an idea of how South Africa could become a more equal country and what people in other countries could do to assist that?
One of South Africa's biggest problems is that we adopted a policy of Black economic empowerment, which enriched a few while the majority remains outside of the economic system. We further were subjected to economic policies along the lines of the IMF and the World Bank, which restricted the amount to which the government should be focusing on our spending on education and other social infrastructure. We are beginning to realize that something needs to happen, and for that to happen quickly. And unfortunately, I'm not able to say that the South African Communist Party is making much of a contribution in helping us shape our economic policy, and also in as far as the political parties represented in our parliament. We do not have a credible left party that can help to bring about the change that's needed. There's a lot of rhetoric. The issue, for example, of land, which is important, the redistribution of land has become a very important issue, and we support this. But again, it's all caught up in a lot of rhetoric and not enough action happening.
I think this will be the last question, after which I'll ask if you want to say anything else. The last question is it's a bit more personal. You shared some of the injustices done personally to you by the apartheid regime, and could you share something about your inward process after that? Maybe to do with, is it to do with forgiveness? Is it to do with reconciliation? Is it to do with justice? Can you tell us something about your inward process of going from there to now?
I think in the past 23 years or so, I've had time to think through my own experience. Personally, I feel that I was doing what needed to be done. I do not feel that I'm owed anything. But at the same time, I worry about generations after me who have experienced what is called intergenerational trauma. And it still remains very vivid in our lives, and how do we actually address it? I had support. I often would say I was lucky to have experienced, for example, detention and solitary confinement, while there was an organization outside that supported me, that made people aware of my situation. I had letters of support from the anti-apartheid movement, which I didn't see, of course, at the time, because I wasn't allowed any contact with the outside world. But I think that kept the police on their toes, in that they would not easily get away with, say, anything drastic, which they might have been thinking to do. But I often worried about young people who were detained, who didn't have the same support. And of course, some of my own colleagues were severely tortured. We actually lost some of them. So all of this still needs to be addressed, because each person experienced their situation differently.
Thank you. There's lots of thanks to you in the chat, lots of appreciation for what you've said, and lots of people saying that they're going to think about it. And we are very close to the end of our time. Is there anything that you want to add?
I just wanted to thank friends for joining me this evening. I know it's a difficult time under COVID, meeting remotely, but I feel very connected to all of you. And I particularly wanted to say to Tim, thank you for mentioning that George Fox said those amazing words when he was in prison. I felt close to the statement that he made: be examples, be patterns. I think that message from George Fox resonates with me, and I leave you with that message, that all of us can be examples.
Thank you very much. We'll finish with some stillness, and we can leave as we feel moved, and we'll close the meeting in a few minutes.